Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry for the late start. Ironically, I also started this exact same lecture 1 year ago late because I was listening to it beforehand, and I apologize for the exact same thing. So apparently it's tradition for this particular lecture for me to start late. Now, in my defense, I do have a number of links that I have to set up and a number of pages that I have to open to make sure I get prepared. You'd think that I would be a little bit better about that, saying, "Oh, I probably better give myself a few extra minutes." But if it's tradition, then I'm going to continue on with it. All right. So we're going to be talking about IT standards today. I'm going to try to avoid being repetitive. One of the things when I was listening to the presentation that I had from last year is it felt like I was saying the same thing over and over again. I'm probably still going to do that, but I'm going to try to do less of it today. I do, however, want to start out with a discussion about something, kind of some future plans. So just as a reminder, we're going to be doing our first Excel assignment as well as we're going to have our first quiz on Friday. We'll start with the quiz and then we'll do our Excel assignment. The Excel assignment will probably be beyond the scope of class unless you're just really, really good at Excel, which I'm sure everybody's good at Excel in this room, but I'm talking about like can do things, very complex tasks in a few seconds type thing. So that's not a challenge. I take as much time as you need, but it will go beyond the scope of class, but it will be due the following week. So something to keep in mind is we'll kind of have our first dynamic assignment to do, something that goes beyond the scope of classroom. As far as planning for the future, we have our first data analytics assignment deliverable on week 5. And I know it's like this is week 2, week 5 is so far away, Dr. Barnes. It practically is. Yeah, I'll be graduated by then. It's like no, actually, week 5 is not as far away as you might think. We're going to actually hit the Labor Day holiday in this very next week. And a few people have already talked to me about their plans and what some of the ideas they've already had. And I think that it's good to think about that now. So those of you who have thought about it, great. Those of you who have not, I would encourage you to do so as soon as possible. Now, it's not required that you share your information with me or share your ideas with me now, but I do encourage you to do so, especially if you have questions about them. I do want to talk about some things that you should consider depending on how you're collecting your data. So if you remember when we talked about this assignment, I said there are basically 3 different types of prompts that you can do. And I want to talk a little bit more in depth and detail about how those work. So the first one is going to be archival data. This is definitely the easiest with respect to how to collect data for your project. There is a bit of a concern though. There is a little bit of a caution that I'm going to throw out. And that is that if you decide to do archival data, it's very difficult to formulate your question first and then find data that fits that question. Simply because for archival data, you're taking already existing data and then you're trying to answer a question. What I would encourage is that you kind of try to identify your data set first and then determine what kind of questions you can ask based on that data rather than the other way around, because it's going to be a very, very onerous task to try to find a data set that meets all the parameters that you have set up. I think in the assignment link, when I was giving you some advice, I said go to Kaggle. That's a really good data set source. It's got a wide variety of data sets that you can utilize. That's not the only one that you can utilize, but that's just a really, really big, broad one with a wide abundance of data sets. And I've used several of them for examples in this course. The second one is the more challenging one. That's going to be survey. What I would say about that is that this is going to be a more robust, designable data set possibility. It does require substantially more work on your part to set up the design, because not only do you have to create the survey and to poll the questions, but you have to get approval to do so. And that's something called the Institutional Resource Board, Institutional Review Board here at Truman State. You actually have to fill out an application, provide the design that you're going to be doing, and then you've got to submit the survey. It does take a little while to do it. If you have something that you're personally passionate about, I had one student that was really passionate about polling Mac students and trying to figure out if they feel that they've got something out of the program. Created a really, really great experimental project last year that we actually found a lot of value for the accounting department, our accounting program. So that's not something that you're required to do, but if you have something that you're just really, really interested in asking a question for, I encourage you to do so, with the caution that you should start thinking about that now, about how you're going to approach that now. The third possibility is going to be AI design. This is a fairly new one. It's not really common in research, but it is something that holds a lot of promise, especially if you have interest in how AI tools can actually be parallel to human behavior. An easy example of this would be a research piece that a accounting professor named David Wood, very well-known accounting professor in our circles. He did a research piece several years ago where he tried to determine if the current iterations of ChatGPT could pass the CPA exam. So this was ChatGPT 3.5, and it was a resounding failure. All right. Basically, ChatGPT's guesses were no more than, or answers were no better than guesswork. And so it was kind of interesting to see this big thing that has potential and promise basically could not do this level of critical thinking. He has since replicated this study, or at least other authors have replicated the study, and they've got much better results. We actually, for those of you who are taking a seminar on auditing with me next year, we're going to talk a little bit about that, about why that's the case. But it had a lot to do with the models that they kind of developed in the future, as well as the ability to develop better prompts and better procedures for asking questions of the AI tools. So you would do something similar, is that you would develop your question and you'd say, how do I actually use the AI tools to emulate human behavior, and will it provide me with responses consistent with human behavior? So you first need to know, what would your expectation be for a human response to this particular situation? Like, for example, for the CPA exam, you'd expect the human response to kind of be a curve right around 75. That's a passing score. And basically see what the pass rates are. That's the expectation. And then you measure what the answers are. Now, it's not a perfect parallel. For those of you who know anything about grading on the CPA exam, it's not 75% of answers correct. Okay, a score of 75 does not represent that you got 75 score correct, but that's how they measured it. They said 75% of the answers were answered correctly, so we assume that's around 75. And so you may need to make a little bit of assumptions, but if you decide you want to do an AI comparison, you need to have a baseline expectation and then use the queries to do that. I also want to throw out there that if you decide to do an AI research query, you can't just ask one question of the AI tool and then say, all right, I'm going to compare that to what I expect a human, and done with research. Okay. It does need to be a robust research design. This is a semester-long project. So that's what I want. That's why I'm talking about it now, is something that you need to be thinking about now rather than later. I will tell you that if you wait till week 5 to start working on your question, it will likely be at a question that you have no practical interest in. It's just something you came up with last minute. So start thinking about those questions now and how best to approach them. So that's my advice for that particular part of the project. And again, if you have any questions or any concerns about that, feel free to reach out to me. I'll give you some suggestions on how you can approach something, but this is something that you do need to start working on, thinking about now. Now, with respect to what we're going to talk about today, that was the fun part of the class. Okay, that was me telling you about what's supposed to be the fun part of the class. We're going to be talking about IT standards, which the IT standards we're going to be talking about are something that we're familiar with. We've talked about them in multiple class sessions already. We're going to be talking about COBIT. We're going to be talking about ITIL. We're going to be talking about ISO 27000. So I gave you some resources that I wanted you to look at, and I wanted you to do some comparisons. Some of these are kind of, I don't know, just kind of background questions. You might even think of them as throwaway questions, because this is not something that's relevant to knowledge for advanced AIS. And I'd say that's fair, but I do think historical knowledge of this will kind of set the stage for why this is important and why it's critical that we understand this. So let's go ahead and talk about kind of the individual questions, and then we're going to get into a little bit more depth on what's going on with these particular standards and what they represent. So according to the ISO, or about ISO section of the ISO website, how many national standard bodies are members of ISO? So we're going to start out with group 1 again today. So Sadie, what did you and your group identify for this one? Okay. Yep. So 1 per country. And then what is the name of the U.S. standards body? American National Standards Institute. So kind of some interesting participation there. So there's a few things that I want to talk about, and these are just informational. There's a possibility I may ask you about questions that were, or topics that were in the question. Like I may say, how many member bodies are there in ISO? That's a valid quiz question. Probably not an exam question. That's a little bit too deep or too specific. But I may ask you, what does ANSI stand for, or what's the name of the U.S. organization? These next few are just more informational. So does anybody know how many countries are in the world right now? This is an interesting trivia question. I didn't know. I looked it up before class today. So it's 193 recognized by the U.S. and 195 if you consider the Vatican City, or the Holy See, and then also the state of Palestine, which is not officially recognized by the UN. So 195 roughly, and so this encompasses quite a bit of the the companies that are the countries that are recognized in the world. So there's a lot of participation. There's also the question about what does ISO stand for, and the English translation is International Organization for Standardization. And why is it not iOS instead of ISO? And the answer is actually kind of funny. This is something I just discovered today after teaching this for probably now, I think we're going on 6 years of me teaching this topic. I have never actually defined the answer for this. I always assumed that it's because it was a translation issue, because this is a European organization that has membership across the globe. And I thought, well, this is probably a translation for French. Well, no, actually what happens is if you translate this name to French, it's Organisation Internationale de Normalisation. That's how, and I apologize for anybody who speaks French. I know I just butchered that, but that was what I found out. So it's not iOS's translation to French, and the translation to other languages is even more off of the ISO initials. What they actually came up with is that they would never be able to come up with a set of initials that would be applicable to all countries. So they just settled on ISO as the abbreviation. It literally stands for nothing. It stands for nothing. It's like ISACA that we talked about last week. ISACA stands for IT Technology Governance or IT Governance Institute. So it's kind of fascinating how these things come up. I don't know. For those of us that are about to take Becker in the future, for those of you about to take Becker in the future, you assume that acronyms have actually basis in reality, and this one just doesn't. It's just kind of there. All right. So I'm talking a little bit more about ISO. So this is kind of an interesting one. According to the standards section of the ISO website, aside from information technology, what business process areas do the ISO standards cover? Kennedy, what's your group say on this one? I think, oops, I'm sorry. It's in the standards section, not the about ISO section. So all these kind of here in addition to the IT security standards. So what can we say about ISO? Is this a organization that's just heavily emphasized on business operations and IT security standards? And does it seem to be the kind of the the group that's parallel to stuff like COSO and AICPA? They have like much broader reach than it appears. Okay, they've got quality management, environmental management, health and safety, food safety standards, which is kind of interesting. I always think of food safety standards as being fairly regional because you talk about Department of Health in a certain area, like how those operate. But this is kind of a global perspective on these. So ISO definitely has a much broader reach than just we're talking about IT governance. Now, it does have a few IT governance standards. This is the most well-known one we're going to talk about. We are going to mention another one next week that actually relates to IT governance, kind of parallel to IT governance. It's not actually IT governance, but something that's very close to it. But it does have standards in a broad array of areas. It's important to keep in mind, though, that these are kind of macro perspectives. These are considered to be organizational concerns, so it can actually reach any number of areas. I did want to throw a little bit of a note out there because I say it's macro perspective, so we're talking about the organization as a whole. But the IT standards are very similar to like the COSO components, where they can actually reach different levels of the organization. So they can have standards for organizational operation as a whole, and they can have standards that actually hit functional or location operations. So very, very robust set of standards, and we kind of saw that when we looked at the 27,000 standards, which we'll talk about in the subsequent question. All right. Moving on. Moving to COBIT. According to the COBIT article, what version of COBIT is currently in use? Jonathan, what'd your group identify for the current version of COBIT?
The current one is COBIT 2019.
Okay, yes, and I do want to throw this caveat out there. We always have to say 2019, okay? We cannot say COBIT 19, all right? That leads to a lot of confusion, leads to a lot of queries. Is like, why is Dr. Barnes talking about the pandemic? And the answer is that wasn't, you have to say COBIT 2019 to avoid confusion. That's just a really unfortunate year to make that update right there, have something that sounds just like that. So 2019. Yeah, so as stated in the paragraph, one major difference. What is COBIT designed to do? So Jonathan, I'll stick with you for this question.
Yeah, designed to focus, the last time was designed to focus on security, risk management, information governance, with by purpose to serve the framework for IT governance and management across organizations. And then the other half was like what it's not designed to do. It's not designed for business process organization or technology management, decision making, or like IT strategy.
Okay, so this alludes to something that we talked about. Now, you may say, Dr. Barnes, Jonathan just said something that was contradictory to something you've been telling me. And I want to say, hold on, give me a second to talk. Okay. So in the definition talked about IT governance and talked about business operations, but also the definition actually included risk management. And you may remember that when I talked about COVID, I said its focus is not risk management, but this just kind of contradicts that. Now, there's a couple of things I want to throw out there with respect to that. First of all, I do not think that's the primary focus, but is it possible to actually have organizational governance without risk management? Is that something that is feasible to do? Like, can you govern an organization and just ignore all security in the organization? Probably not. I don't think that's a feasible approach. So that's why I think that's incorporated in that. That does not necessarily means that it's the primary focus of it, but it is something that they have to consider as part of the standard setting process. Secondly, there was the thing that Jonathan said about what COVID is not designed to do. Okay, so it is not designed to do as far as let's just take a look at the article. That's easier. Oh, this is also something I want to throw out here. Yeah, whenever you use free articles, that you will get all these pop-up ads, and it's just annoying as heck, you know. So, and I asked this question. This is just rhetorical. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. But how many people out there would just rather pay for something without the articles? It's like no, no. But it's like that's one of the problems that we have with a lot of social media nowadays is that people don't want to pay for social media, and so now we got this data mining associated with this, and this is completely irrelevant to our conversation. But yeah, because we want free stuff, then we're bombarded and deluged with all these invasions to our sanity and our privacy. So, all right. So I'm talking and not paying attention to what's going on. So what does it say? Okay. State in paragraph in the beginning.
This is a paragraph again with one page. I think.
Okay, so a little bit further. I think I could read my own writing, but
Oh.
oh, there we go. All right. So one major difference COVID versus security, risk management, information governance. Okay. So it isn't designed, sorry, COVID isn't a framework for organizing business processes, managing technology, making IT-related decisions, or determining strategies or IT strategies architecture. Rather, it's strictly as a framework for governance and management of IT, enterprise IT across the organization. So if we're talking about this statement right here, what is it trying to allude to? Is it saying that it's not related? It actually says it's not related to determining IT strategies or architecture, but does that mean it's not a strategic infrastructure point? I think that there's strategy involved with this, but it's not necessarily telling you how to accomplish that strategy. All right. And again, what was the term that we used when we talked about COBIT with respect to other frameworks? So COBIT is trying to design what they're trying to determine what the problems is, what the issues are that we need to address. All right. So if that's the case, where does the how come in? The answer is how comes it into other frameworks? This is a very broad framework, as we're going to see next week. Spoiler, we are going to be looking at this stuff again next week. I told you this was going to be tedious. Anyway, we are going to look at this next week, and we're going to see that COBIT is a very broad framework, and it's intentionally by design, because the questions it's designed to answer are very, very broad in context. All right, moving on. What does ITIL stand for? Okay, I actually answered this question on Monday, but Kate, I'm going to ask you the question again, just because it's up here. Information Technology Infrastructure Library. Very good. So what version of ITIL is currently in use? ITIL 4. All right, which creates some confusion for one of the later questions, but that's okay. According to the ITIL article, what is the primary focus of the version of the ITIL framework? That's right. So basically, we want to make sure that IT can answer any problems or any issues with the organization and can be able to address those problems in a clear and effective manner, in a quick and effective manner. So ITIL is going to be something that's very, very strong counterparts to COBIT. In fact, we're going to talk about it or look at a video of it here in just a little bit. It's going to kind of explain how these join together. But let's go ahead and talk about this really quickly in context. Now, ITIL can actually serve multiple purposes simultaneously, but what did we say previously was one of the main focuses of ITIL? So IT service management, how do we translate that with respect to one of our qualities of our qualities with respect to IT. So we had different qualities. We talked about the nature of security or risk, but what was paramount to those? Value. Okay. Value was kind of the primary goal. I think with service management, we're talking about how can we actually derive value from the IT components. So I would say ITIL is more focused on the value component, whereas we're going to talk about ISO 27000. That word security implies that we're talking more about risk. Now, again, I'm going to try to not repeat myself, but this is going to be a recurring theme over the next few weeks. Is it really important that I'm repeating this over and over again? Do you think that that's something critical that you need to remember? Yes, and if you've got that by now, then great. Then all my redundancy moving forward will be noise. But if you don't have that, then it's really, really important and prominent that we actually think about this in context to everything that we're discussing. All right, let's move on to the more broad questions. So click on the hyperlink for IT security standards. And so this is going to be what the standards were in the family. How many standards are in the ISO 27000 family? And what is the broad objective of these standards? So let's answer the first question first. Megan, how many standards did your group identify?
One source we found said more than a dozen.
Yeah.
Another one said more than 20.
Mm-hmm.
So
So this is going to be the traditional accounting answer. And Megan, if you'd said the traditional accounting answer, it would have been correct. So what is the traditional accounting answer? It depends. Okay. What does it depend upon? It really depends upon when you ask this question. All right. So more than a dozen is always present. And it's true. Okay. I guess anything greater than 12 is always going to be more than a dozen. So that being said, if you do a little bit of a search, if you try to look up all the standards and do a search there, then you can actually find varying amounts. And we've done this exercise many times. In previous years, it's been as many as 50. In one year, I think 2 years ago, it was 23. I think it really depends on what ISO website is displaying as the prominent relevant standards at a current point in time. So my answer is probably going to be is that I think there's probably 20-something standards that are very highly prominent and relevant to any organizational operations, and there's supporting standards that could number around 20 more that are not relevant all consistently, but may come up from time to time. So again, if I ask you this question on a quiz or exam, then more than a dozen or it depends would be fine answers. Okay, so and then yeah, so that's going to be the point. Now let's go ahead and get to the more important question. What is the broad objective of these standards?
it is to help organizations establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve an ISMS type information assets through effective security, cybersecurity, and privacy control.
Right. All right. So you actually alluded to some things that we're going to talk about a little bit later in this course, and it's important to note that this is tying everything together. But you said 4 letters, ISMS, which stands for Information Security Management System, with the emphasis on which word? Security. Yes, security, because we've talked about our goal here is to understand how these standards all address risk optimized business value. Okay. Which component do they address? Now, in large part, they address all of them, but the emphasis on this one is going to be on the risk component, making sure that risk is managed properly so that organization can properly achieve business value. And this relates to anything that has to do with IT resources. And one of the big concerns about IT resources, or some of the big concerns about IT resources nowadays, as Megan pointed out, cybersecurity or privacy. Those are both issues that we're going to be discussing in more detail. So threats to existing security within IT resources, that's going to be one of the large prominent goals of the ISO 27000 series. All right, about halfway down the page, click on the ISO link for ISO 27018, which again, just recently got up to 2026. Again, one of the hazards of using free resources is they do update, which is better they do update than they don't update, because that means that they are actually being thorough and diligent in their results. I do like that COVID article that I actually had you all read from the CIO, or I think it's the CIO journal, and they actually update that COVID article every year. So it's kind of nice, but there's some danger, because if you do the work preparation in the summer, you may come back later and find out that things have changed. There's the story that I told about fraud, which we'll hear again because I repeat my stories over and over again. So let's answer the following questions about 2026 instead of 2018. Okay. So we already answered the question, what does ISMS stand for? But since this is a preview, we're only able to view the content of the first 3 sections. What does the information in the section 3 entail? Cora, what did your group identify for this one?
It covers the term definitions used in favor of standardized vocabulary around the standards.
Good. Okay. And I think that's a very clean, concise definition of the goal here. Now we're going to get into that. I didn't just have you look at this for busy work. I mean, some of it was busy work, but for the most part, I do have an objective. I think the best way to approach this would be able to actually look at the entire standard. And when I first started doing this, I thought that's not practical to do because it probably costs thousands of dollars because this is designed for large organizations. Turns out it's only a couple $100, but I didn't think anybody in this room would just be like, let's go ahead and pay a couple $100 so we can access the standard. And then we could use it for one class period and be done with it. So again, this is the kind of the cost benefit. I do think that there's some benefit from being able to understand the definitions because one of the definitions they actually talked about in there is they talked about the term audit. All right. Now, when they talked about audit, do they mean audit in the context of how we define audit from our perspective? No, basically when they use the term audit, they're talking more general, basically providing understanding and reassurance about what the resources are designed to do. So it's trying to check and make sure that those resources are properly. It's not a financial statement audit. It's not not a internal controls audit, the way that we kind of consider that. So why is that important? Because the definition is contextual based on how we're using it. All right. So that leads to the next question, and I'm sticking with core in this one. Okay. In your opinion, do these terms adequately cover critical terminology related to ISMS? Why or why not?
You said, yeah, relevant, it's relating to risk and security, talks about how, or it talks about organizations, how they should be governed and managed, and it has terminology for like information security is nothing to do.
Yes, and it's really important to understand that, again, the contextual definition is what's important here. If we're talking about information technology governance, then the terms need to be defined in terms of information technology governance. Now, how do we actually talk about that? When I talk about the nature of audit, that's kind of that's the example, but let's use a much simpler analogy, a very basic analogy, all right? What is the definition of the word pound? All right. Again, the accounting answer is always, it depends. It depends on the context. Okay. If I'm talking about the symbol that's used when you're creating a hashtag, okay, that is definition of pound. Okay. It talks about the measure on the scale when you step on it. All right. Those are both valid definitions of pound, but they are contextual to the situation. I said, okay, define pound for me. You would have to stop and think and say, I'm not sure what he means by pound. I need more information. I need more information. So this is what provides our definition for understanding how these terms are applicable in a certain environment. That's why this is such a critical terminology component. I do want to stop here, and I do want to take a look at a video here. So I've alluded to this already, but I did want to talk, just take a quick note about what the difference is between 27001 and 27002. Again, I do not think that it's important to be able to distinguish this definition. It's unlikely that I will ask you this in any context, but I do think that you may encounter this, and understanding this is really important. So if you encounter this in the real world, you do need to be able to distinguish. And I think I've alluded to this already, but this guy does a much better job than I do explaining it.
So what's the relationship between ISO 27001 and ISO 27002? They're often used interchangeably, which can lead to confusion about their intended uses. In this video, I'll provide a high-level overview of the differences and relationships between these two standards. Hi, I'm Danny Menimbo. I'm a principal here at Shellman. I'm based in Denver, Colorado. I've been with the firm since 2013. I co-direct our ISO certification services practice and also oversee our Mountain and West Coast attestation services. ISO 27001 is a management system standard which provides the requirements for establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving what's referred to as an information security management system, or an ISMS. Now, what's an ISMS, you might ask? It's a collection of people, processes, and technologies with the purpose of managing information security risk within an organization. This is the standard that you get certified against. So where does that leave 27002? Well, the intent of this standard is to be used as a reference for determining and implementing the controls to address and mitigate risks identified during your ISMS risk assessment process. They are contained within Annex A of ISO 27001 and will often comprise what's referred to as your Statement of Applicability, or SOA, which is a tool utilized during your risk treatment or risk mitigation process based on their applicability to your unique environment and scope and the results of your risk assessment process. Now, you cannot get certified against the ISO 27002 standard.
I think that's plenty for right now. So let's just reiterate what Danny was talking about. By the way, Danny seems like a very happy individual, but it's not the happiest person we're going to see here in just today. All right. So he basically said that ISO 27000 series is identification of risks, and then ISO 27002 is the controls. Does that kind of allusion to something we've talked about previously in AIS and other courses? Yes, we know that risks have to be identified as part of business processes, and these are risks that are specific to the IT governance process. And then we know that if a risk exists, there has to be implementation of a control to address it. So this is just kind of a sequential step that we've already talked about before. Basically, risk assessment occurs as part of the IT evaluation process. And then the second step, ISO 27002, says, here are the controls that you can put into place to address those problems. Now, again, it's not really important. If you said 27,000 series on the exam or on a quiz, that would be just fine. We're not trying to make a big distinction here, but I did want to make sure that you understood when one is referred to as another, it's referring specifically to either the risk assessment or the controls. All right. Moving on to question number 7. The current vision of COBIT was updated to include focus areas. What are some examples of these focus areas? Going back to Sadie, what did your group identify for some examples in this area?
Small and medium enterprises, cybersecurity, digital transformation.
Okay, so small and medium enterprises, cybersecurity, digital transformation, and cloud computing, those are the ones you identified? That's good. That's consistent with my answer. So we're doing good there. All right. So yeah, so it's important to note that these are that within the article, they actually said that the current version is also designed to incorporate or remove focus areas as needed. Now, this is the payoff question. All right. This is the one that's really, really critical with respect to this. Why is this an important characteristic of COBIT? And Sadie did such a nice job of answering that. We're going to stick with you on this one.
With COBIT being designed to incorporate or remove focus areas, it's important because it allows COBIT to stay aligned with emerging trends, new research, and ongoing feedback. All
right. So good definition. Simple way of saying that is that as things change, then the COBIT needs to be updated to address those changes. So if I were to say, if we're looking at COBIT right now, we're saying, here are some focus areas that are really important here. What's one that you think probably should be incorporated that's kind of prominent in business and technology right now that might be relevant to IT governance? It's two letters I'm thinking about. AI, yeah, AI is kind of one of the ones that I'm surprised has not been included in the update there. But I'm sure that it's incoming. I'm trying to think when's the last time this article has been updated. I do want to check that. Well, 2023. I said it was updated annually, and then I lied to you. It was not an intentional lie, but it's been updated annually since I remember. So it's entirely possible that COBIT 2019 has got a focus area update. All right, but let's go ahead and move on to discussion here. Where we're talking about some things that are not necessarily as relevant or important as the things that we're going to be talking about now. So, and I hate this scrolling setup. So there are things that I want to talk about. Oh, wait, that's why, because I'm in the wrong article. There we go. And there's another pop-up. All right. All right, so I want to go moving on to ITIL infrastructure. So scrolling down, what are the ITIL 4 guiding principles? This is always just really confusing because tell you in the question that I'm looking for 7 guiding principles, but then it says ITIL 4. So this ITIL 4 is the standard, okay? And then the guiding principles are number 7. So you'd be more clear if they said ITIL 4 and then put 7 after that, the letter or word 7. So here are the 7 guiding principles. Now, let's going back to the question. Which of these principles do you feel are most consistent with the primary focus of ITIL identified in question number 4? Kennedy, what did your group identify for this one? Okay. I think focus on value is one that I would definitely include there. I do want to talk about one because there's one that's always been a kind of an argument point for this particular course. So the very first one you identified, think and work holistically. So what does holistic mean? By the way, if you don't remember, I've talked about this in prior courses with you all. If you see a word that you don't know, should you say, well, I'm just going to ignore it. It's probably not important. If you don't see a word you don't know, we live in a day and age of incredible technology where you can look up any piece of information and get knowledge about it already. Like I go to Wikipedia probably a dozen times a day just for things that I don't know. Usually it's irrelevant information, like what actor starred in this movie. But That doesn't mean that I still use it any less. Okay, so holistic. All right, you probably heard of holistic medicine. It's like, oh, that's hippie medicine, Dr. Barnes. So this is hippie IT, right? That's not what we're talking about. Holistic basically means you consider the nature of the entire entity. You consider the whole. Okay, WHOLE. All right, even though it's spelled differently. So think and work holistically. Do we think that that's going to be a relevant approach for ITIL guidance? That we think about the entire entity when we think about how we implement our standards and practices? I think that makes sense because we do need to understand what the effects are going to be on the entity as a whole. If you implement one practice within a part of the organization, how will that affect the operations in other parts of the organization or as the entity as a whole? So I do think that's one that's really important. It's not necessarily obvious though, especially if you don't know what holistic means in that context. If you think it's like holistic medicine, you maybe it's like, that's a throwaway answer, Dr. Barnes. Okay. Anyway, but I do think that you can make an argument for any of these as being relevant. But if we are going to hold on to those, I think the one that what focus on value is probably the most important one, and then the runs that follow after that are still relevant and important, but it really is understanding what we're talking about in context. Next question. Are these principles consistent with the article's stated objective of integrating IT in the overall business structure and encouraging collaboration between IT and other departments? Jonathan, what does your group say on this one?
For number 9.
For number 8. Second question, number 8.
You said that the principles are consistent with the article's stated objective is that we can keep going out. The department, the main principles look to create a culture between departments by collaborating and automating.
Okay, so did any of the groups just come back on the negative answer on this and say, yeah, these principles are trash? Yeah. Holistic, what are we talking about? Holistic medicine, Dr. Barnes, come on. Did anybody just kind of negate that? Any group step up? I don't think any group has ever stepped up and said, yeah, these are terrible principles, Dr. Barnes. Because what does that imply if they're terrible principles? That ITIL itself is terrible, or that we'd have to be responsible for developing our own principles? Is anybody courageous enough to actually do that at this point? I certainly am not, and I've been teaching this course now for I don't forget how long, but again, that's kind of getting past the point of the question. The question is that do these achieve the state objective in integrating overall into the overall business structure? And the answer to that question is that we have to consider whether each of these individual components relate to the entity's operations as a whole. That's why I was really, really critical in focusing 2 of those principles very, very heavily: business value and thinking and working holistically, because those by definition are going to focus on organizational objectives, not just individual objectives. So I do think the answer is yes, but it's not immediately apparent as to why that answer is yes. All right, so IT literature in a few instances uses the terms IT governance framework and IT control framework interchangeably to describe ITIL. And you may say, that can't possibly happen in this course, Dr. Barnes. You're too smart for that. And I'm saying, well, just wait till next week. Yeah, because we're going to be talking about IT control frameworks. And guess which ones are going to be in the ITO control frameworks, IT control frameworks? The same ones we're talking about today. We're also going to have a couple of new ones as well. Well, one old one and one new one. But based on what we've learned about ITIL, which of these terms, if either, is most appropriate? And I don't know why I said why or why not, because I actually made a choice, so that's bad terminology. But ignoring that, Kate, which term do your group say was most appropriate and why?
Efficient, flexible IT departments for the overall organization doesn't focus on IT security.
Yeah, I do think that's a good explanation, is that our goal here is not just exclusively on security or risk or controls. It's mostly about the organization's operations as a whole. So if that's the case, how do we get off on saying that these could also be used as IT control frameworks? Seems like a misnomer, especially since I'm doing it for next week. I'm actually talking about these as control frameworks. How do we get away from that? Well, it leads to something I talked about at the beginning of the lecture. Can we have governance without controls? Probably not. That's a core component of that. Just for kicks, just for giggles, let's just ask the alternate question. Can you have controls without governance? Probably. You could probably have a risk assessment without overall governance, but does it serve any real productive purpose to have controls without governance? No. So it would be an argument to say that these are inseparable concepts. They're not the same thing. Governance is a much broader concept than controls, but controls is a necessary component of governance. So that's really kind of what we're trying to get at here, is that these can be used interchangeably, because even though they're not the same thing, they're somewhat inseparable from one another. You can't have one without the other. It's like peanut butter and jelly. If you ever eat a peanut butter sandwich by itself, it feels like it's missing something. I don't know. Anybody ever do that as a kid? Eat peanut butter just by itself? You weirdos. Anyway, I don't know. I had my fair share of peanut butter sandwiches, so I am a weirdo too, which probably explains a lot. All right. According to the COBIT article, COBIT best suits the clients that use multiple frameworks. Is this consistent with everything that we talked about or learned about IT governance and control frameworks so far? So let's answer this question, and then I want to talk about actually answer these questions, and I want to show the final video. All right. So we use these COBIT suits best suits clients who use multiple frameworks. So COBIT's going to be used in unison with other things. Okay. Is this consistent with frameworks we've used so far? Megan, what's your group say on this one?
This is consistent with.
Okay. So if that's the case, why is using COBIT in isolation unlikely to be effective?
It just says no single framework covers every part of IT governance, risk control, security, and service management. Using COBIT in isolation is unlikely to be effective because COBIT is a high-level governance and control framework.
Great answer. Great answer. So, Cora, I'm going to give you the last question. It's a much simpler answer. Could the same thing be said about using ITIL in isolation? Okay, I thought you were just going to say yes, but that was actually a good definition. Well done. Well done. Yeah, good explanation. So yeah, they achieve different objectives. So it's a little bit like putting a puzzle together. If you have certain puzzle pieces, you can't say, well, I'm missing this puzzle piece, so I'll just use this one in its place. It's not going to accomplish the same thing. Now, how do these get used together? We've already alluded a little bit to this, but I do want to take a quick look at one last video. Now, I'm going to make a note here on this video. This is an older video. It looks like it's 12 years old. So these are different versions of ITIL and COBIT. I do think that the overall practices and principles that we're going to be talking about can still be applicable here, but the frameworks that they're going to refer to are not the same frameworks that we're talking about in this particular lecture.
In this short video, we're going to look at the relationship between COBIT 5 and ITIL. I'll begin by emphasizing that the two frameworks complement one another. It's not a case of choosing one or the other, you need both. The two do have some common concerns, some shared interests. For example, both frameworks describe a number of processes that should be established by a well-run enterprise. In some cases, a COBIT process maps directly onto an ITIL process. For example, the COBIT process BAI06 Manage Changes maps onto the ITIL Change Management process. In other cases, there is no simple mapping, but there is a common concern. For example, the management of risk across the service lifecycle has a high profile in ITIL, but it does not describe a formal process. COBIT, on the other hand, describes process APO12 Manage Risks. Broadly, COBIT is concerned with what IT should be doing, whereas ITIL is more concerned with how it does things. The two frameworks are both concerned with IT, of course, but each has a different focus. ITIL is very much focused on IT. Of course, it recognizes the primacy of the business. It emphasizes that IT exists to support the business. But the bulk of its advice relates to matters internal to IT. COBIT, on the other hand, has the whole enterprise as its concern. Yes, it advises on IT-related issues, but it also recognizes that those issues are not limited to IT professionals. COBIT is a whole enterprise framework. COBIT and ITIL share a number of important characteristics. Both are frameworks. The significance of this is that they provide guidance that an enterprise can draw on to devise solutions that are appropriate to its unique situation. Neither provides an implementation blueprint, neither is a recipe book. Both frameworks derive from real-world experience, so you can be confident that they provide practical advice, that they will work. The frameworks are based on experience drawn from a wide range of enterprises, commercial, not-for-profit and government, organizations both large and small, and enterprises operating in many different countries. Their advice can be applied by any organization.
All right, so I want to talk about two things that I think are relevant here, okay? Actually, one thing that's relevant and one that's just an observation. But the first one that is relevant is that he made a comment at the end of this, what we just talked about. He said, neither is a recipe book. And so the whole point here is saying it'll give you guidance on what and how to do things, but it will not tell you what the specific tasks are to accomplish. Now, so thinking back to 417, remember when we talked about it at the beginning of 417? I know it's been a while for some of you in this room, but remember we talked about 417, we talked about materiality. And my frustration with materiality is that when you talk about materiality, PCOB says you have to address materiality, but they don't tell you what the procedure is. There's no defined procedure. It just says you're supposed to assess materiality, go. And so that was one of the frustrations that I've had for a very long period of time. It doesn't give us any guidance in that regard. This is kind of the same thing. And I think this is true for a lot of very high level guidance, is that it will tell you what needs to be addressed, what the concerns are, and what your responsibilities are. But how you address that, how you assess that's up to you. So it's important to note that the guidance itself is still broad. Even if we're talking about ITIL, there's not a specific series of tasks or procedures that need to be performed. So that's the important takeaway. Now, the other observations I wanted to note is that if you go back to this part of the video right here, these are some of the happiest people I've ever seen in my life, okay? I looked out when I was talking about this lecture, okay? I saw a lot of just very, very impassive faces, okay? I'm just looking forward to the day that I can talk about COVID and ITIL, and, well, at least this lady and this guy right here, she looks like she's faking it, all right? She honestly doesn't look like she's very, very into what the discussion is. But yeah, that's my goal right there, is to actually get so engaging with this topic that I can actually get those kind of reactions out of people. All right, so that's our discussion for today. We'll do our stuff on Friday, but I'll see y'all then.